Good afternoon, everyone. We are just going to give it a couple of minutes for others to arrive to the webinar. Just give us a few minutes here. Okay, the attendee list is growing. I'm going to wait maybe 30 seconds. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Paz Artaza Regan. I'm Program Manager with Catholic Climate Covenant, and I'd like to welcome you to the Covenant's first webinar of 2019, Catholic Perspectives on Investment in and Divestment from Fossil Fuel Interests. As we get started, always, we start with prayer. Let us open our hearts to the reality that even through this virtual medium, we are always in the presence of God. And if you will join me, in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. O Lord, giver of life and source of our freedom, we are reminded that yours is the earth and its fullness, the world and those who dwell in it. We know that it is from your hand that we have received all we have and are and will be. Gracious and loving God, we understand that you call us to be stewards of your abundance, the caretakers of all you have entrusted to us. Help us always to use your gifts wisely and teach us to share them generously. May our faithful stewardship bear witness to the love of Christ in our lives. We pray this with grateful hearts in Jesus' name. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Chose this prayer because I think it does center us on the issue of stewardship, which is at the root of what we're going to be discussing, stewardship of the earth and how we are in stewardship of the investments and financial matters in the church. Before we get started, I also like to give you some housekeeping items. Yes, the video is being recorded, and we will be sending it to everybody who registered within the next couple of days. There will be question and answer session after both presentations. You may submit your questions by writing them in the question box on the right side of your screen. You may wish to indicate who the question is directed to when you submit your question. If you have audio issues, it's usually due to Wi-Fi connections. You can try to connect via phone for better audio. If you go to that audio box, it'll give you the option to switch to phone. You just click on that right-hand box and follow those directions. At this time, I'd like to introduce our two presenters, and I am extremely delighted that they both were available to speak to us today. Speaking first will be Reverend Séamus P. Finn, who is a member of the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and he's responsible for the faith-consisting investment program for the Oblate Investment Pastoral Trust. He has also been a member of the Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation ministry team of the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and is currently director, and this is an alphabet soup, and I think I might be able to decipher it, the United States province of the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate of the Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Office. Did I get that, Séamus?
Very well done, just right.
Okay. Reverend Finn has represented the Oblates at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, or ICCR, and is currently serving as ICCR's board chair. He also represents the Oblates at the International Interfaith Investment Group and other interfaith investment initiatives. He is responsible, including the active engagement as shareholders with individual corporations and participation in various roundtables that include mining sector and oil and gas sector issues. Speaking next after Reverend Finn will be Amy Woolham Echeverria, and she is the International Coordinator for Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation, JPIC, for the Columban Missionaries, and board president and founding board president of the Global Catholic Climate Movement. For the past 6 years, she served as the Columban JPIC coordinator. She is the founding contributed to the founding of networks such as the Global Catholic Climate Movement, the REPAM, which I believe is Red Panamazonica, which is Panamazonian Network, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, and also Catholic Climate Covenant. She served on several boards, steering committees dedicated to social and environmental justice. In her bio, she talks a lot about being 25 years ago in the resettlement offices in the United States and then in Chile, which I go hoo-hoo since we've got then 2 Chilean connections on this webinar. While in Chile, she began working with the Columban Missionaries as their national coordinator for JPIC. Her studies include theology and spirituality with an emphasis in ecological and cosmological theology and spirituality, and she's written on various themes with environmental justice, interconnected for academic, education, and advocacy purposes. At this point now, we move into the webinar itself, and we're going to get started with Father Séamus. If you'd like to go, Reverend Finn?
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, and glad to be able to join in this webinar, and thanks to Paz and to Amy for the work that's gone into preparing it. And I've got a number of slides here that are fairly basic, that will cover a few of the, I think, the salient issues related to the subject, even though it's a pretty complex set of issues that we're going to try and discuss, and look forward to questions afterwards. So if you want to move on to the second slide, that'd be great. So I don't really need to review this for folks, but just for those who may not be familiar with the socially responsible, faith-consistent investing network that's out there. This is a network that's been pretty active over the decades, and the organization whose board I chair at the moment, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, is approaching its 50th anniversary. Catholic religious orders were very much a part of that from the beginning, and did in fact create the National Catholic Coalition on Corporate Responsibility in 1973. Always, I think, in looking at investments, people are looking for guidelines and policies, and we rely and have relied over the years quite a bit on the official guidelines from the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, which were first presented in 1990 and were revised in 2003. With some hope that they will go through further revision in the near future. There are also other bishops' conferences in the Catholic world that have produced some guidelines. The ones I'm most familiar with are the German Bishops' Conference and the French Bishops' Conference. That's also led to a whole proliferation of other guidelines and funds that are tools that are available for investors, Catholic faith-based investors who want to apply some kind of a faith or ethical screen to their funds. They could be index funds, mutual funds, or asset managers who have put together specific funds that are aligned with the bishop's guidelines and also with other guidelines that they may add. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Just two quick background pieces here. I think Caritas in Veritate, the Pope Benedict encyclical, added some very important direction, motivation to the activity that was going on in this space. When it talked about economic activity must be structured and governed in an ethical manner, and I think that's still very much a part of the debate that is out there about inclusive capitalism and natural capitalism. And when others are talking about the impact, the ways in which capitalism has contributed to inequality and to abuse of the planet. I think he also talks about in number 37 that the canons of justice must be respected from the outset as the economic process unfolds, and not just afterwards or incidentally. So that speaks to a proactive inclusion of justice canons, ethical and moral canons, as one deals with economic matters, whether it's administration or management. You can jump forward. I think the clearest, obviously, call then came from Pope Francis in Laudato Si, when he points clearly to the fact that this sister, our common home, cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. So in some ways, this kind of is the impulse or the trumpet call for many who have taken up much more aggressively in recent years the question of climate change. And I think one piece that the Holy Father and others have added to this from a religious, ethical, and moral perspective, and this comes out in many other ways as well, that the issue itself is important from all different kinds of perspectives, but the Laudato Si and many church documents lift up the concern of its impact on the poor and the marginalized, and those who are on the front lines of immediately now being impacted by it. So we can jump forward. Options available to investors who choose to fulfill their ownership responsibilities. I think the investor class basically needs to be continually reminded that with ownership come rights, but with ownership of anything also come responsibilities. And so how do we exercise them, whether it's our automobile or our house or any other properties that we have? So the ways that that's done usually for investors is developing some kind of investment policies, choosing screens, what will I invest in, and negative screens, what don't I, or what do I want to not invest in. Voting proxies is ways that people express that ownership, supporting reading proxies and voting those when they come out on an annual basis with a public company. Filing resolutions for inclusion in a proxy book. Going to an annual meeting of a corporation or that you might hold equities in and speaking there. Meeting with corporate representatives. Those are all options. And then the final one that is divesting, is simply making the choice that none of the above seem to adequately either express the view of the investor or have not proven satisfactory in getting the kind of results that somebody's looking for. We can go forward. I think the key points in that I'd like to lift up is that climate change has been on the agenda of investors for many years, and some were very, very prescient in this, in the sense that they had been paying attention to it for a lot longer than others, and many in the religious community. I think, as with many other issues for investors, the concern emerged from a number of data points, and that whether those are scientific data points or the other kind of stories that are recounted by impact communities. I know there was some interesting photography presentations I saw recently of just the work of a photographer who travels the world photographing over time the impact of climate change on Antarctica or on different shorelines and the like. And that pushed the thing that investors were asked about its implications for their commitment to responsible ownership. And so two of the ways they approached this was simply to review their investment policies, and secondly, to engage with priority industry sectors. It has implications for all the industry sectors, I think everybody now realizes, but probably on the front line of that were fossil fuel companies, oil and gas companies, utilities, mining companies, automobile manufacturers. I could go on. And I think the next step that was very much a part of that was, how do you evaluate the risk? And how do you evaluate the risk from a financial perspective? Even though the shares that I hold now don't look like they have a lot of financial risk exposure, what's that going to look like in 10 years? What's that going to look like in 20 years? And particularly if I'm managing something like a pension fund, or if it's an endowment that people are still going to be hoping to draw on 25, 30 years down the road, how do I make that assessment on the risk? The next slide, I'll go on to just kind of give you a sense of what's going on in this area of activity today. Folks are continuing to review and revise their investment policies and their screens. And when I say screens, I mean negative screens, which we're probably most familiar with, which are exclusionary. That's basically saying what you do not want to invest in. Positive screens are something that are gaining a lot more traction and attention. So people looking at, well, what industries, what companies out there have taken the climate change challenge and made commitments, so I want to invest in those companies and hold those shares? Or are there alternative energy funds, whether they're wind or solar or geothermal, or they may be geographically situated in distressed areas or areas that are challenged? So is it appropriate as an investor for me to deploy some assets into those funds? And then finally, I think the engagement umbrella, which is a hallmark of ICCR's approach and its members' approach to much of this, is have I increased the amount of engagement I'm doing with companies about their climate footprint, their greenhouse gas emissions, or their exposure? Many coalitions out there. I just picked out two to highlight here, and you've got the URL. The Carbon Disclosure Project is one that's particularly metric-driven, and a number of investors rely on. The Climate Action 100 is a bit more intensive, more recent, that focuses on the companies that are immediately and directly connected to the whole climate change question, and engages them through a number of vehicles. And I think the final thing is that there's lots of calls on all fronts for measuring and reporting. If companies are measuring what their impact is, what kind of measurements are they using, and how often are they reporting on the results of those measurements? You can go to the next slide. I just give you a sense of a more practical sense of the Carbon Disclosure Project. In 2018, 2,370 companies reported on responded to the climate change questionnaire. Others, part of the questionnaire had to do with water and forests, which, as you can see, would be related to the climate change question. So these companies have now been scored according to the comprehensiveness of their disclosure and their actions towards a low carbon economy. So investors will be part of the carbon disclosure project, use their research to look at these the reports of these 2,500 companies, and that gives them real data that quite often they do need to rely on in making informed decisions. You can go on to the next one. And then I think the challenge that many face on this question is basically, in terms of engagement and with the different companies, is that something that they are have taken up and have orchestrated as their response, or is divestment something that they're feeling like is a path that they need to follow? And I think we've seen both of those as part of the choices that Catholic institutions have made. You can go on to the next, or is there an next one? Finally, simply, I think really an important contribution on this end has also been from the other faith traditions, particularly the Orthodox and the Church of England. Archbishop Welby and Patriarch Bartholomew IV have indeed and joined with Pope Francis in, I think, pushing all of us to do something. They were active leading up to the Paris Agreement negotiations. They've continued to remain active in urging people of faith to see this as a part of their invitation, their vocation, and continuing to try and urge us, I think, to look at the ways in which we can move this conversation forward. There are the conference at the Vatican last year with the oil and gas sector is probably a good practical example to conclude on. The Laudato Si document and Pope Francis have often focused on, well, how long is the transition from the fossil fuel dependent energy system that we have to clean alternative sources of energy, and how does one measure progress in that transition? We know there was a great deal of differences of opinion between the industry and the Vatican and the Holy Father and other religious leaders on that, and that still is a pivotal question. I think that investors face, that all of us face, because we recognize that we're not going to make the transition overnight. How do we make it in a way that doesn't jeopardize the reliance of some communities in the developing world, particularly those who are still deprived of a constant source of energy or electricity, and support them in their efforts also to make the transition. So I'll leave it there for now. So thanks much and look forward to any questions.
Paz, you ready for me to go?
Did we lose our moderator?
Have we lost everybody?
No, you've got attendees on there, so I would go ahead and.
Okay, thanks, Séamus, and a word of thanks to Paz and the Covenant, and also to the participants. It really is a pleasure to be a part of this conversation today and the ongoing conversation and process. I'll focus on our Columban missionary experience in relation to divestment, and I'd like to begin my sharing by recognizing that our process is both imperfect and incomplete. We're a work in progress, and it's a long-term process. So just want to recognize that. Next, please. So our Columban commitment, this is a very familiar call to all of us, hearing the cry of the earth, hearing the cry of the poor. And our Columban commitment is grounded in this call from Laudato Si. And it really is at the heart of our missionary identity. We believe that divestment from fossil fuels has spiritual, environmental, economic, and social implications and consequences. And this has been the grounding and foundation for our discernment and action. Next, please. Here I'm sharing with you two of our guiding principles from our socially and environmentally responsible investment policy. We began our SRI journey in the 1980s, which is also when we began to articulate our commitment to care for creation, particularly issues on climate change, water, extractive industries, genetically modified organisms. And I think what we're trying to capture in these principles is that we see all vulnerable life is in need of protection, care, and respect. And we don't want to limit ourselves and our concern just to human life, protecting human life exclusively, but really to hold all of creation in that embrace of protection, care, and respect. So moving on to more into the details of our own experience, I think it's important to note that we are an international missionary society. And I think it's important to know that because in this conversation, different organizations will have different needs, perspectives, circumstances, and resources. So for example, a parish or a diocese or a university or even individuals who are going through this discernment process and conversation around divestment and engagement, you know, we take our unique circumstances and realities into account, and what that means is that in my opinion, there's no one-size-fit-all response. So, as an international missionary society, you know, we looked when we began our conversation around divestment from fossil fuels. We thought it was important to develop a team approach, and so we invited voices from different stakeholders. So we had ordained members, which would be members of our general council, members of our general bursar's office, our chief financial officer's office, myself as the international JPIC coordinator. We had lay professional staff, both in JPIC and in finance and investment. We had lay consultants in our investment committees. We had different cultural perspectives, gender perspectives, and all of this diversity shaping the conversation. You can see that in that pie chart, we have 3 investment committees, major investment committees throughout the society. The United States holding the largest portion of the society's investments. Hong Kong has our smallest portion of our overall investments, in Australia, roughly a third of our assets. Next, please. So you'll note the Laudato Si quote at the top, where Pope Francis urges us to make that rapid shift without delay from fossil fuels to alternative renewable forms of energy. I think it's worth noting this is our recent chronology of action steps. We have been involved in corporate engagement in the past prior to 2012, and so we do have some experience in that space. But in 2012, our General Assembly, which meets every 6 years, we identified our desire to deepen our commitment to socially responsible and environmentally responsible investments. So that launched a consultation process that took the better part of 2 years. And in that process, I can tell you that Séamus and the Oblates were really key voices for us and partners to talk to. And Séamus mentioned the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, other religious congregations, our current investment managers. These were all important people that we talked to, as well as our own internal conversations and consultations. In 2015, we finalized our policy to include divestment from fossil fuels and to include positive impact investing strategies. We also included a structural change, which was to include justice, peace, and integrity of creation representation personnel on all of our investment committees. We thought it was really important to have that persistent, clear voice in those spaces. And we also commented in the policy on the importance of ongoing education and formation. And I'll say more about that in just a little bit. 2015 and into 16 launched two and actually three important launchings. One is Laudato Si. That's been such a significant teaching from the church that Columbans have been actively involved in promoting and embracing. Another key launch that year was the birth of the Global Catholic Climate Movement, which Columbans have been integral in getting established. And as part of the key work of GCCM, the priority of divestment from fossil fuels is a key programmatic campaign and work. So we found that an important space for us to engage with other Catholic organizations committed to divestment. And then I'd also like to note, but it's not on the slide, is the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative. That's another network that I think is an important space for people to connect with. So in the end, through the process of the consultation and updating our investment policy, we committed to taking steps to divest from fossil fuels and invest in positive impacting investing, which we felt was what was most consistent with our commitment to hearing the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So moving on to some more concrete steps of implementation. As I mentioned, we have 3 investment committees. The Society's investments are held in 3 different countries with some very small investments in other countries, but for the most part, Australia, Hong Kong, and US. If you could go back to Australia, please. Roughly, Paz, if you can return back one slide, if possible. So Australia has 30% of our overall investments. Sorry, you're not able to see that slide, but so the step that we took there, as we did with the other 2 investment committees, was to review our accounts for exposure. How much did we actually have exposed to fossil fuels? And with that, we took a portion of our funds and moved them into an individually managed fund, kept the rest of the investments in the commingled funds. And in that individually managed fund, we were able to tailor it such that there's no exposure to fossil fuel extraction, fossil fuel burning, or fossil fuel infrastructure. We've also been able to apply the Carbon Underground list, which is a list of 200 of the most egregious companies. And so that was our step, and we'll monitor that for the next 3 to 5 years. Moving on to Hong Kong, all of our assets in Hong Kong are individually managed, so we do have the ability to tailor our screens, and we review that regularly. We also are working with our Hong Kong managers to seek positive impact investing options. I think an important part of the Hong Kong piece is where our general counsel sits, and our Hong Kong council has a kind of broader a broader mandate for overall society investments. And so in this process, we have discovered the need to reevaluate our governance and investment structures. So for example, membership of our investment committees, terms of service on investment committees, where are decisions made at the investment committee level, at the general counsel level. So in some ways, it has slowed our divestment process down, but I think in the long term, it'll be a kind of, one step back, 2 steps forward. I think another real component worth mentioning is, as in any religious order, we have, with some regularity, changes in our leadership, new appointments. So there's this kind of ongoing rolling process of educating people and bringing people up to speed, and that also impacts timelines and progress. Next to the United States slide. So the United States is where the largest amount of our funds are held, and again, we did most of our funds are commingled, and so we established that roughly we have 5% exposure to the fossil fuel industry, and it's been an opportunity for us to have deeper, more regular conversations with our current manager than in the past. We've taken a much more proactive engagement with our current managers, and so that's been an ongoing dialogue in the U.S. Next, please. Paz, can you advance to the next slide? So I just wanted to touch on some of the challenges and opportunities that we faced. In terms of urgency, we do see the environmental crisis, climate change, as calling us to, hearing that cry of the earth, as calling us to respond urgently to the needs of the wounded earth and the vulnerable poor. We also recognize to the right that we take a long view, that this isn't a product. It's a process. It's something that's ongoing, and so it's very unlikely that there'll be a kind of one and done moment that it's ongoing. I think definitions have been hard for us to navigate. What do we mean when we talk about divestment from fossil fuels? Are we committed to a full divestment, partial? What's our timeline? These are challenges that we've worked through, or that we continue to work through. And I think a big part of that has been education on the right as an opportunity, where JPIC personnel, we have had to learn much more about finance and investment, and our personnel and investment, our finance and investment personnel has gone through some education and formation around our JPIC commitments, like climate change, extractive industries, and so forth. A challenge has been the commingled funds. Just from a practical point of view, that's been a barrier for us to divest. While commingled funds does offer a degree of diversity, it does, do we take that approach, or do we have the individually managed funds where we can have a more tailored approach? So that's been a challenge, kind of working through that. I think what that has led us to, though, is a dialogue with each other and with our managers, so that we can continually try to refine and align our values and our practices. Séamus mentioned differences of opinion. We have found that to be very much true in our experience, that internally and externally there have been all kinds of differences of opinion about financial health and well-being, for the society in divestment, or do we place the mission and the vision and the values as central, and the investments support that. It sometimes has felt an us versus them kind of conversation, but at the same time, I think it has urged us to be more nuanced, both internally and externally with our partners, with other networks and movements and coalitions. I think in the end, Columbans, we're trying to do what's right for us. Our commitment to divestment from fossil fuels, though the decision has been fairly recent, I would say it very much is deeply linked into our long history and identity of caring for creation, caring for the poor, and it will continue. I think, as Séamus also has mentioned, collaboration is key, that we don't do this alone. Divestment has brought us into relationship with many people and in conversations. And I think fundamentally as Christians, we're a community of believers, and as such, the divestment work is a communal process. Next, please. So in conclusion, I just would like to say that, in my experience, and I think the Columban experience, is that no one person, no one experience, no one movement has all the answers. I think we're all seekers, we're all on the journey, and the most important is that we're seeking and that we're engaged, and finding the right path for each of us in our circumstances. For Columbans, that seeking has led us down the divestment path. It's led us down the positive impact investing path. And Séamus mentioned that meeting with oil and gas company executives last year, and I'd like to bring my comments to a close with a quote by Pope Francis from that gathering, when he says, "Yet even more worrying is the continued search for new fossil fuel reserves, whereas the Paris Agreement clearly urged us keeping most fossil fuels underground. This is why we need to talk together, industry, investors, researchers, and consumers, about transition and the search for new alternatives. Civilization requires energy, but energy use must not destroy civilization." And as I was thinking about using this quote, I thought it's kind of a funny one for me to end on, considering that we've chosen the divestment path, and here Pope Francis is talking about, urging us to talk together. And, I think only Pope Francis can do that. In one sentence, both call us to be in dialogue and also call us to radical choices that move us to a deeper relationship or deeper relationship with all of creation. And as I said in the beginning, the fact of the matter is, we recognize that there are multiple strategies for change, and we need them all. And the Columban story is an imperfect story, an incomplete story, but again, as Pope Francis said, I think the important thing is to do the seeking, do the discernment, and take the actions where we feel we're being called. And so, in that faithfulness, I think we find progress and change and transformation together. And I'd just like to conclude with an invitation that there will be a conversation on divestment again in Washington, D.C. on March 15th. This will be hosted by the Global Catholic Climate Movement and member organizations. So we can share more information about that after the call. So thank you again, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you both, Séamus and Amy. And I'm back. I had to take my own prescription and call in because of audio issues. So it doesn't happen just to participants. It also happens to presenters. We are, the first question I'd like to put out here, and I think it's first going to go to Séamus. This one comes right to the point, and it follows on Amy's last parts of her conversation. Pope Francis has stated that he believes strongly on action on climate change. Where's the Vatican on divestment of fossil fuels? Are they going to or not?
Well, far be it from me to speak for the Vatican, of course, but I would say from my experience and from my conversations, it's an issue that they are wrestling with. I think that there are two pieces to it very clearly. That one is the teaching example of the Holy Father and the Laudato Si, and the different statements that we referenced. And then it's the different bodies within the Vatican structure that manage their assets. And there is some work going on developing investment guidelines. I suspect what will end up happening is that as that proceeds in the coming year, they will have to wrestle with the whole issue of divestment, or how they're going to practically implement what the Holy Father has talked about, and they may do this in a gradual way as well, because I think many faith-based and Catholic groups have looked at divesting or excluding thermal coal, tar sands, stranded assets. So it's a very graded, gradual kind of approach. So there are a lot of options within that framework. So I suspect what we're going to have to end up doing is encouraging them to grab the nettle, as it were, and at least begin to be a bit clearer than they have been. I know that there is some work going on in this space, and they may need a bit more encouragement or pushing or advocacy to help them to stay on track.
These questions are for Amy, and I'm combining them. How did the Columban, did you consider shareholder advocacy before considering divestment? And how did your investment consultants react to your divestment proposal?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of that question, Paz.
How did the investment consultants, if you had any, react to your wishing to divest?
Okay, thank you. So the first question, had we engaged in corporate advocacy? We have engaged in corporate advocacy both in the United States and in Britain. We have been members in the past of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility and the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility in Britain. So we do have some experience in the past of corporate engagement. And however, when we went through the discernment process at this point in recent time, we felt that as we think about what hearing the cry of the earth means to us as Columbans, that we felt that dialogue with the earth needed to take, we needed to take a more radical understanding of what hearing that cry meant. And so for us, the choice to divest is what was consistent with that understanding. Our investment committees, we have 3 investment committees, and I would say it's been a range. In Australia, for example, they were the first to proactively respond to the updated SRI policy. You know, their approach was, this is the updated policy and we need to find a way to implement it. So they went about the business of implementing it. In the United States, for example, it's been much more of a process of educating and dialogue back and forth about the why, the how, So I would say, you know, different contexts have produced different different responses and speeds of response. So it's been mixed.
Right.
I hope that.
Yeah, I think that explains it. Got a lot of questions on this issue, and I think it was from Séamus's presentation. You mentioned the 200 most egregious companies that needed to be divested from. There was a list, and a lot of folks are asking for more information about that list, about where can it be found, and whether that list is like from the S&P 500. What's the connection?
Actually, I think it was Amy that mentioned it, but
it was Amy? Okay.
It is on the fossil-free website, gofossilfree.org. That's what I'm familiar with. But Amy, you may want to add to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that I was referring to the carbon underground, the carbon 200 underground. So if you just Google that, it should take you to where you need to go.
Okay. Got a question for Séamus, and it's regarding has there been any influence on Catholic church funds in England, Wales, and Scotland? Do you know anything about that?
Not in great specificity. Certainly, there's been plenty of conversation. I mean, the divestment campaign that Amy talked about is a global Catholic campaign. So it's on the agenda in most conversations across meetings of Catholic investors. I think, which is always important to keep in mind, that there isn't any great pooling of resources here at the end of the day. Each institution, whether it's a parish, a diocese, a congregation, an educational institution, a medical system, they all control their own assets. And so sometimes the media gets it wrong when they kind of try to lump us all together. So I think that's why you've got lots of different entities, and it's not any different in the other faith traditions as well. So important to pay attention to the specific identity of the group that's making a statement or a commitment. So I don't know that I've seen anything, and I'm in contact certainly with the Catholic groups in the UK, that I've seen a whole lot of specific groups that have made public statements on this, but I'm sure there are some.
Mm-hmm.
Paz,
yes,
Paz, could I add on
yes?
to what Séamus just contributed?
Of course.
I would invite participants on the webinar to check out the Global Catholic Climate Movement Divest, Invest website, and you can find there a list of all Catholic institutions that have signed on to a divestment commitment, and that's an ongoing campaign. Twice a year, new announcements are released with new Catholic organizations, institutions that have committed. So again, if you want to see a list of Catholic institutions that have made a divestment, a commitment, that's where I would direct people to take a look. And that's Catholic Climate Movement .global/divest and reinvest.
Amy, I'll include that link when we send out the link to the webinar recording.
Thanks.
So folks can have it. Here's a question. We've gotten a lot of questions for both of you regarding how individuals can divest. Second, how to pressure colleges and dioceses on divestment. And then the third question, which I thought was very interesting, is the Catholic community also looking into pressuring banks that are investing funds that destabilize indigenous communities' water and forest resources? So it's not so much on that question as just divesting from the banks, but pressuring. So that one may be for Séamus. So Séamus, you want to deal with that one? And then if you want to also start on individual divestment versus diocese colleges, and Amy can follow with that one.
I think we've done, from the ICCR community and members, there have been a number of initiatives that have coordinated engagement with major banks on assessing their climate risk exposure. I know they've been, so they're seen obviously as they are in most activities, the front line, because they provide the financing. And I think investors are interested if they are overly exposed to industries or to projects or to pipelines that may, have a short shelf life in terms of their productivity. The question is, what's the impact on the return that I'm expecting from holding shares in your institution? So there is a fairly broad campaign of engagement with banks on this issue. And lots of ICCR members are a part of that, but also other investors are part of that. I would say on the question of, on colleges, universities, and dioceses, those are more community organizing questions than anything. Pressure is what at least puts the topic about engagement or divestment on the agenda for all these institutions. Have their own investment committees. They have their own trustees. The diocese obviously has the bishop as the sole corporation soul. So one has to put together a strategy. There is plenty of that going on and plenty of those conversations going on at Catholic colleges, universities, and at dioceses. And from time to time, as Amy referenced, the campaign with the divestment campaign, you'll see announcements made of where those have been successful or not. Less for individuals, I suppose it comes down to how much money do you have, right? Because this is, if you go to somebody and ask them that you want to be, you don't want to be invested in fossil fuels, there's some work involved in doing that. So there may be a fee involved. But there are also more and more funds being created now that you can directly invest in. So two things are important. One is if it's a mutual fund or a fund that is advertised as being fossil fuel free, it's not going to cost you anything more to do that. But if you're giving specific instructions to your money manager about, excluding this number of companies or this sector, or then if there's more work involved, it may cost you more money. Now, if you have if you're Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or somebody who's got some billions involved, it's probably not going to cost you very much. So it's important to be aware of that. But I'm sure Amy has some comments on the Catholic colleges or universities stuff as well.
Amy, and your answer is probably going to have to be the last one. We will try to get all the questions answered through email. Okay, so this will be the last question on the webinar.
Great, thanks, Paz, and thanks, Séamus. I think there was a previous question about bishops and dioceses in the UK and divestment. Again, if I would direct people to go to the Global Catholic Climate Movement page on divestment. You can get a full list there. But for example, the Irish Catholic Bishops Conference has made a commitment to divestment. You'll see there are several archdioceses around the world that have made a commitment. Caritas Internationalis and national Caritas offices have made divestment commitments. So I think it's helpful to look at that list so that people can identify in their local context or their particular kind of structure, whether it's a university or a religious order or a diocese or a parish. There are lots of points of reference on that website. So I'd encourage people to go there. And I think what I heard Séamus say in our own experience is, how to get universities to commit to divestment. What I have found particularly effective in the Columban experience is to to form a team with representation from different voices, students, faculty, board of a university, etc., that can come to the table and think through this together. And if you need a particular contact for universities, feel free to contact me or CCM directly through that website that I mentioned.
Great. Thank you. And keeping with our commitment to keeping this to an hour, we will send out the recording to everybody, and the links that were talked about during the webinar will be included. I want to thank both our presenters for joining us today and giving us this wonderful introduction, overview, as well as a targeted look at divestment. At this point, if you want more information, you can send an email to info@Catholic Climate Covenant. I will then pass it on to Amy and Séamus. They will have also the questions so we can respond to your individual questions. Thank you. I know many of you are in places that it's very cold. I hope that you stay warm and go out there and try convincing people that weather does not mean the same as climate. That just because it's cold does not mean that global warming is not happening. That's my infomercial for the day. Many thanks, and I wish you a blessed day today. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks much, Bas.
Thank you. Bye-bye.